Welcome. Welcome to POPCORE 4, where we'll be discussing eco-orchard design and implementation, and the exploration of how to design and establish orchards and food forests. Tonight, presenting will be Sharon Apia, the orchard manager, Phil Forsyth, our co-executive director. I'm just going to do the intro, but I'm Corey Spellman Lopez, our POP's education director. We also have Michael Mielbauer, the special project coordinator. And for you who are new to POP, we are the Philadelphia Orchard Project, a nonprofit that plants and supports orchards across Philadelphia. This is our 15-year anniversary, and we are right now working with 66 different orchards. But you can find out more about us at our website, and we'd love to know who you are. If you haven't already, please share your name in the chat along with an orchard that you're representing, or if it's just your home orchard. And then if you have any big burning questions you're coming in with about design, go ahead and put those in the chat, along with any chat or questions that come up for you as we're going. You can put those in the chat. Our behind the scenes team will be answering questions as it can, and then we'll have some question and answer sections throughout to have a little discussion. So we are at POPCORE, the Community Orchard Resilience Education. This is our second year doing it virtually. It's a 4-part series. We are in part 4. So we went over orchard care and pruning, pest and disease management, harvest and use last week, and this week, orchard design and implementation. But we have so much more planned for the rest of the year after this is over. We've got workshops coming up and volunteer opportunities, lots of harvest events planned for the whole season. You can find that on our events page on our website. Sign up for our newsletter so you get regular updates of what's going on with us, or follow us on Instagram or Twitter. The agenda for tonight is 1, defining the terms. We're going to talk about what is a community orchard, an eco-orchard, permaculture, agroforestry, agroecology. And then we'll go into orchard siting, base mapping, and other design considerations. Next, we'll go into plant selection and sourcing, followed by question and answer time, and then go into community engagement, polycultures and food forests, steps to implementation. And then throughout, we'll have case studies from as kind of examples of what we're talking about with POP orchard designs and plantings. And then we'll end with a little discussion. So to start us off, Sharon is going to be defining the terms.
Thank you, Corey. So we're going to start off by defining a few terms. So first we have, what is a community orchard? So POP plants community orchards, and we define community orchards as orchards that are planted and cared for in collaboration with community groups. So POP currently, as Corey just mentioned, works with 66 orchard sites all across the city of Philadelphia. And this includes a wide range of groups. So community gardens, places of worship, schools, and nonprofits. And the goal of the community orchard is to uplift and empower food sovereignty. And if you're not unfamiliar with what food sovereignty is, it's the right of the people of the community to healthy and culturally appropriate foods through ecologically sound and sustainable methods. Community orchards also help communities control the food resources in their neighborhoods. So some benefits to having a community orchard is your yields. So the crops that provide food, medicine, and more, they can have a great ecological impact. They have great educational value. You can have micro enterprise with a community orchard. And of course, it's a beautiful, safe, intergenerational gathering space. Next slide, please. Thank you. So when we define an ecological orchard, we define it as combining the best practices from holistic, organic, agroecology, and permaculture approaches. So what this means is that they all share the commonality that they think of orchards as ecosystems that are complicated and have multiple yields and various functions. We don't just view an orchard as a space that just pumps out fruit for us. And we like to implement regenerative perennial agriculture. So when we say perennial, we're talking about plants that we plant and they come back year after year. And when we talk about regenerative, we talk about how over time they will improve, the plants will improve the soil, the ecology, and the yields over time. As we grow in a space, we want to improve the resources that are providing to us. And we also want to support human and non-human species. So some strategies for establishing an ecological orchard are cultivating the soil and plant health. We want to implement companion planting, so different plants being in the same space. We want to maximize yields and diversity. And we want to, as best as possible, limit the use of sprays and other human inputs. So permaculture. So this is one system that influences how we design pop orchards. And it's based on 3 core ethics, which is earth care, people care, and fair share. It's a system of ecological design that was coined in Australia in the 1970s by Bill Mollinson and Dave Holmgren. So this has a focus on reducing consumption and sharing what's left over, sharing surplus. There are 12 design principles, and they're based on the observation of natural ecologies. And so it's actually the origin of the food forest terminology that POP uses to describe the orchards that we plant all over the city. So with agroforestry, we use this to describe any sort of agriculture that incorporates trees. There are various forms of agroforestry, and they've been practiced and developed by Indigenous people worldwide. Some examples include perennial and annual plant polyculture. So this means growing more than one crop species in the same space at the same time. We have managed forests and foraging. There's game livestock animals under a managed canopy, as you see it on the bottom right-hand corner. And then there's alley cropping, which POP actually implements at our learning orchard at the Woodlands. And so this is when you're growing perennials or annuals under tree crops. Sustainable agriculture is increasingly embracing the idea of agroforestry as an approach to climate change mitigation and adaptation. So steps taken in agroforestry can help with climate instability for things like soil degradation or local food insecurity. With agroforestry, we're basically working more closely with nature to create accessible food sources and a more equitable standard of living. Next slide, thank you. So what is agroecology? Agroecology views agriculture as a part of the ecosystem, and it's concerned about the impact of agricultural practices. So it's concerned about the agricultural impact of habitat biodiversity, the animals of the land and the sea, climate impact, and long-term viability, for example. Agroecology is commonly practiced and stewarded by Indigenous people all over the world, and it's spoken about in food sovereignty movements to include people, equity, and cultural experience. And the movements have largely been led by women of color. We at POP recognize that regenerative future requires understanding and dismantling of historic and ongoing oppression. And the POP's eco-orchard approach incorporates aspects of agroecology. So at POP, we want to humbly acknowledge that we work in unceded Indigenous territory of the Lenni Lenape and the Wissahickon people, who were and continue to be active stewards of the land. We recognize that words are not enough, and we aim to actively uphold Indigenous visibility and sovereignty for individuals and communities who live here now, and for those who are forcibly removed from their homelands. So we offer a land acknowledgement, and we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and want to work to hold POP accountable to the needs of Indigenous peoples. And this year we are working to do some plant rematriation. So if there's anyone here who is interested or is connected with any local Native groups, please get in contact with us and we can collaborate. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it on over to Phil, who's going to dive into eco-orchard design considerations.
Thanks, Sharon. Hey, everyone. We've got a lot of information to get through. So the goal here is to give you some sort of overview of design considerations and some links to additional resources for more learning. And these we will be reposting this whole workshop to YouTube for further viewing if there's parts you miss. There's a lot of dense material, so we can get started. Next slide. So starting off in terms of square one, where are you going to plant your orchard? Basic considerations. Think about, of course, amount of sun. And I will be talking about some plants that can be grown in less than full sun, but most orchard plants require as much sun as possible for good production. Soil, very important. In most cases, you can work with what you have, and often in the city we don't have so much choice about where we're planting. It's whatever property our community partner is associated with in their neighborhood. But you always want to start with a soil test to understand what you're dealing with in terms of pH level, nutrients, and help you determine what soil amendments may be necessary for a healthy, productive orchard. But we have worked with very challenging urban soils full of rubble. We have planted orchards on formerly gravel lots with great success. So you can transform existing soil and make them appropriate for an orchard. Water is important as well. Most orchard plants do not like wet feet. So you want to avoid areas that stay wet for a long period after a rain. You also want to be aware of sort of where water crosses a site and take that into consideration. There are some orchard plants that will be a little more tolerant of wet conditions, but very few are happy in fully wet soils. Airflow, important to think about as well. So we talked a lot about in POPCORE 1, pruning our trees for getting good airflow through a tree. That's very helpful for disease control in particular. But you want to think about on this site as well. We've found in sites with a building blocking the prevailing wind that becomes much more challenging site to grow some of the stone fruits that suffer from many disease issues. So you want to think about that, is where is the airflow across the site? Maybe you can design plants for specific spots. And we also have a little diagram on the lower left here from Penn State Extension showing where geographically in a landscape you might want to place an orchard. And that usually the preference is for a slope, and for the reasons that the top of a hill gets a lot of cold winds in winter, and then a low spot also is where you will get frost pockets of the coldest temperatures will be in those low points. So ideally on a hillside, a slope is preferred. Next slide. So when you're doing an orchard design, we strongly recommend starting with a base map and actually drawing out your orchard design, not just planting right into the landscape, but thinking about it first, playing around on paper with different locations of features and plant materials. You're going to have the best long-term results starting with a drawn map. So it's often easiest to start with an existing base map, which you can source. We've got two examples here. These are both from one of our community partners, Hamilton Elementary. I think Regina's in the workshop with us tonight. But just newly planted last fall. We'll be planting more this spring. But anyway, on the right we have a architectural design of the schoolyard that we were able to source through the school district and the water department. And so that may be available depending on your site, some landscape architectural drawings. Or on the left, we have a satellite image taken from Google Maps, and that can be a good starting point, especially for a larger site. It may not have all the features, but it's a good starting point. And regardless of whether you have one of these pre-existing maps as a starting point, you're going to want to do some measurement on site in person, taking notes to help you with your design, or you can start your own design if something else isn't available as a starting point. So things you'll want to note in mapping out a site, your design: existing conditions like structures and pathways, existing vegetation, sun exposure in different places across the site, soil and water. Existing community uses is very important for what we're doing. It may not be so significant for rural orchards, but in the city, we need to think about what other community uses are currently going on in the space. And we want to observe over time, ideally, not just go out once and take some notes, but go out and see it in multiple seasons, and we'll get a lot more information about what goes on in the space that way. And in our case, we're working with community partners that are already embedded in the community, in the neighborhood, and we rely on them for that long-term knowledge of what happens on the site. And then measurement and location. So I'll show you on the next slide a few things, but useful things to have: hand scales, graph paper, and I'll show you on the next slide what a baseline and offset looks like. So in your mapping, graph paper is super helpful. And then you can see on the right picture, we also have scales. There's both engineer scale and architectural scales. These are neat little rulers that do the math for you, basically translate the measurements you take on the ground into the scale of your drawing. So for example, an engineer's scale would have different options, like 1 inch equals 10 foot or 1 inch equals 20 foot. So they're just really handy device for doing this kind of translation of on ground measurements. And then the picture on the left is showing you the preferred technique for making a base map is to create a baseline with a long measuring tape. We prefer 100-foot tape, and going along some straight feature in the site, because that's the easiest way to map onto graph paper. So a fence line or side of a building, or often we take a baseline off of the corner of a building and line it up parallel to the wall, so you have a straight measurement coming off of that hard cornered feature. And then you'll take all your side measurements off of that baseline. So you draw the baseline onto your graph paper, and then you'll take the measurements. It's 10 feet out and 3 feet off the baseline, and then you can mark the location of that feature. So anyway, just a whirlwind tour. This is something you need to practice to be able to do well, but it's not complicated. And these are some basic tools you need. So orchard design considerations. So once you have this base map where you've recorded all of the existing features, so things to think about: what is your available space for planting? What are other site uses? Is some of the space used as a gathering space? In our case, many of our partners have annual crop production going on in raised beds or other things, or maybe that's something they also want to incorporate. So something you need to design around. Community and partner input. So this is part of our application process. From our community partners, let us know what specific preferences for fruit they may have, or cultural connections that are significant that may tie to some of the potential plant inclusions. What existing vegetation do you want to keep versus which ones do you want to remove or will need to control to create your orchard or food forest? Existing vegetation can also tell us some things about soil sometimes. Certain weeds prefer compacted soils, wet soils, etc. So they can be used as you gain more knowledge to read the landscape. Water flows and access. So we talked about where wet spots are on site and so forth, but of course we also need to think about where is our water access. Maybe we don't design the orchard to be far from our water source if we're going to be hand watering in particular. Sunlight, we talked about. Is the site open or is it fenced? This may affect some of the design decisions we make. And for us, one of the most important considerations is what is the capacity of the community partner to care for the orchard in the long term. And we have a series of steps that partners go through to help us establish that, but often we'll design an orchard trying to meet that capacity, and we can expand it over time if the group proves successful in management of the space. It's always designed for something that's going to be successful, something within the capacity of the partner. And we've talked about this in earlier POPCOREs, but Philadelphia is kind of an amazing place to grow fruit because we can grow all of the sort of classic temperate fruits, your common fruits, but we're also just far enough south that we can grow a lot of Mediterranean fruits as well. So it's really a broad range of things and is likely to get broader over time with climate change. The other thing about our climate, though, is the high humidity, which means very challenging for us to grow some of the common fruits without a lot of pest and disease issues. So yeah, we sort of break most fruits into two categories. There's the common fruits that are really familiar to everyone, you know, your apples, pears, Asian pears, pome fruits, and the stone fruits, peaches, plums, cherries, and apricots that are familiar and delicious, but they tend to be much more challenging to grow. And the thing we want to emphasize when you're choosing some of these common fruits for your orchard space is cultivar selection. So when you're choosing an apple for your landscape, if you're trying to grow it organically, your number one consideration should not be, what's my favorite one to eat? Or, oh, that heirloom variety sounds really cool, but it should be how resistant it is to disease, because that's going to have a big impact on how successful you are in getting quality eating fruit off of that plant. So there are some wonderful, lovely tasting apples that also have multi-disease resistance, like Liberty and Gold Rush and others. So anyway, we're just encouraging to think about that first in selecting the common fruits. Then we have the uncommon fruits: figs, persimmons, pawpaws, juneberries, mulberries, and others that are just as delicious and interesting, but tend to be much easier to grow. So if you're not interested in doing a lot of pest disease monitoring, spraying, etc., you want to start with those. Next slide. So I'm going to go through, and I don't know if Kim already shared this out, but we just added a new plant list to our website that has some of this information about what we found about what fruits are easiest and most challenging to grow. I feel like this is one of POP's biggest contributions to the Philly agriculture scene is really testing these out, and we're happy to share what we've learned with you, which is that apples and quinces, peaches, and nectarines are really hard to grow without a lot of intensive spraying. So they make our list of most challenging fruits to grow. So do table and wine grapes. And then we have our moderately challenging fruits. So pretty much all of our other common fruits fit in that category. Of the common fruits, the ones we've found easiest to grow are pie cherries or sour cherries and Asian pears. Those are our top recommendations. European pears, pretty fairly pest and disease resistant. And then the other ones are pretty hit or miss. You can get some good plums and cherries and apricots, but they have some challenges. And we put most nuts in this category for the reason that in the city we have major challenges with squirrel predation. For some fruits as well, but really nuts can be very hard to get harvest before the squirrels get to them. And then we have our moderately challenging berries and vines. Native grapes are a little easier than the table and wine grapes. So ones, like Concord and in that family that have native parentage. Blackberries, raspberries, gooseberries, strawberries, most of your other berries, or many of your other berries in this category. I've also put honeyberries, which is a type of edible honeysuckle also called the hascap. And they are supposed to be easy to grow. We have not had much luck with them. We have not planted a lot of them, but the jury's still out on them. So I've put them in this category for now until we see better success. Then we have our easy care fruits. So most of your uncommon fruits fit in this category. I've also thrown chestnuts in here as the most squirrel resistant nut we can grow. So all of these are highly recommended in basically having little to no pest or disease problems for the most part. And same with berries and vines. So these are the easiest to grow. Gummies, currants, josted berries, elders, aronia, Nanking cherries, hardy kiwis, maypops and hops are all quite easy. And again, this is all on that document that was shared out in the chat if you want to read in more detail. Nut trees. So in the city, we rarely have enough space to plant larger nut trees. So most of what we've done have been smaller trees. Hardy almonds, probably the one we've planted most often. Yeah, we talked about them last week, so I'm not going to go into great detail, but they're a cross between a peach and an almond. Hazels and filberts, these are a large shrub, 10 to 15 feet in size, so fit most urban spaces. And then chinkapins are a shrub form of chestnut, a native chestnut shrub that's fairly blight resistant. And then in terms of larger ones, I'd mentioned chestnuts, pecans, hickories, walnuts, and heartnuts are all things to consider for regional growing. We planted a few at larger sites in the city. And again, watch out for squirrels. Fruit for partial shade. So in the city, maybe you have a site with shade from nearby larger trees or a neighboring building. These are all fruits that you could try in a shadier spot. These are not going to produce in full shade, but partial shade. In other words, 4 to 6 hours of light is still going to work for these for the most part. But the thing to keep in mind is that with all of these, the more sun, the more fruit. So if these were planted in full sun, they would produce more for you, but they are worth trying in shade. Of everything on this list, currants are the most shade tolerant, where you might even try below 4 hours of light a day and still get some production. And then mushrooms, something you can grow in full shade. So that is something to consider for a very shady site. Street trees. So we tend to recommend staying away from larger fruited trees in street situations because of the enemies you make by having large fruit drop onto sidewalks, cars, people, etc. Maybe there are some situations on certain blocks where it might be okay, but we don't want to make enemies of urban orchards by planting large fruited trees. So these are our favorites for street trees: Juneberries, cherries, crab apples, hawthorns, medlars, and actually figs have been doing pretty well as street trees as well. So other things to consider when choosing your plant materials for your orchard: pollination. Some fruits require more than one tree or more than one variety in order to produce fruit. But there are some self-fertile trees, so where you can plant just one and you'll get full production. These include peaches, pie cherries, Asian persimmons, figs, hardy almonds, most named varieties of mulberries, grapes, most berries. I did want to highlight here some plums and some sweet cherries. So it really depends on the type. And so you'll need to make sure you are selecting, if you only have space for one plum or one sweet cherry, you need to be sure that you're choosing one that is known to be self-fertile. And there are partially self-fertile plants, ones that will produce fruit planted by themselves, but if there are two of them planted nearby, then each will produce more fruit. So these include apricots, blueberries, some other cherries, some elderberries are partially self-fertile. And then there are the fruits where cross-pollination is required. So this is where you need two different varieties planted, or maybe you can graft more than one variety onto one tree if you have a very small space. But for the most part, apples, pears, Asian pears, pawpaws, Nanking cherries, some jujubes, And some plums and sweet cherries are cross-pollination required. In other words, they will not produce a single fruit if they are planted by themselves. And there are a few exceptions to that rule. That supposedly Cox orange, pippin is a self-fertile, apple shinseki is a supposedly self-fertile Asian pear, at least partially self-fertile. So there may be some exceptions. And then there are a few plants that we plant where there's actually separate male and female plants. So hardy kiwi vines, with a few exceptions, most American persimmons, again with a few exceptions, and some mulberries have separate male and female plants. So the male never produces fruit, but is required to pollinate the female plants, which then produce the fruit. And then the other thing to understand is that not all cultivars are necessarily compatible. So this gets quite complicated in some cases. Next slide. So I'm going to show you a pollination chart. So if you are planting some of these species where cross-pollination is required, you're going to want to consult a pollination chart to confirm that the varieties you're selecting are compatible with each other. And most are, but you'll see the apples here, very early blooming ones and very late blooming ones don't have flowers at the same time, so they're not going to cross-pollinate each other. Then there's occasionally some varieties that are just, maybe they're too closely related, they don't cross-pollinate each other. Or in the case of apples, there's even some triploid varieties that have sterile pollen and are not capable of pollinating any other apple tree. So you see here, Mutsu and Gravenstein are examples of that. So important to consult one of these charts when selecting your varieties. Plant spacing. So this is something most people understood, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but in general, you want to plant things the same, at least the same distance apart as the ultimate height of the tree. And size is mostly dictated by rootstock in case of the common fruits. So we have three main categories: dwarf, stay small, 5 to 10 feet, semi-dwarf, 12 to 20 feet, and standard, which get more than 20 to 30 feet in general. So this is the spacing. In most fruits are not available in a dwarf size. There are apple rootstocks that will keep an apple to that small height. There are some varieties of what are called patio peaches that stay actually super dwarf. And then there are some pie cherries that stay below that height. Anything else you plant is going to want to get bigger. So there's only a few things that come in fully dwarf size. Semi-dwarf is most of the things we plant, and some smaller nut trees, the smaller ones I mentioned earlier, would fit in this category. And then standard are basically a fruit growing on its own roots, or sometimes what are called semi-standard or standard rootstocks will get bigger. So in case of apples and pears, they'll get 25 to 30 feet. These are not commonly planted because it's challenging to manage a tree of that size, although we have found, and some other organic growers agree, that the standard sized trees actually are easier to produce fruit organically. They're just more robust, resilient trees because they're on very strong rootstock. So that is one consideration. They're a bit harder to manage, to harvest, to keep pruned, but you may actually have better quality fruit on some of these standard trees. American persimmons, mulberries, and most bigger nut trees, you'd plant on this spacing as well. So just to help you think about this a little bit, in 130 by 30 space, you could plant one standard apple tree, or 4 semi-dwarf apple trees, or 9 dwarf apple trees. So that's just another way to think about this. And here's some plant spacing for your vines and berries. So you'll notice 2 different measurements here within the row. So if you're planting a row of these things, how far apart each plant should be in the row. And then on the right column, if you're doing more than one row, how far apart those rows should be. So important to be aware of both. And so once you've designed your orchard and picked out your plant materials, where do you source them from? These are there's some local options. So these are for purchasing potted plants. POP does have our own nursery, mostly for planting with our community partners, but we do have plant sales a couple times a year. First one, the spring one, is on May 14th at the Woodlands in West Philly. So join us for that if you want to see what we have. Greens Grow has 2 sites in Philadelphia, Primex Garden Center. Both of these is in Glenside, just outside the city, and both of these carry a lot of fruits, especially in spring. Tree Authority is an amazing wholesale fruit supplier in Percy, Pennsylvania, not too far. And Pittsbone Farm is a berry grower in New Jersey that also sells to the public. And then the other main way to source fruit is mail order, ordering bare root plants, which you can only do in the winter, and they are delivered in the spring. They're mailed to you without any soil. They're dug up as dormant plants and mailed to you. This is a cheaper way to go, and you can get a much wider variety of options from some of these specialist nurseries from around the country, including White Oak as an Amish nursery. No website, you need to write to them to request a catalog, but they're great. Some in New York and further abroad. The only one I wanted to mention here, Edible Landscaping in Virginia, is a mail order option for potted plants. So they actually can mail them to you any time of year because they're sending potted plants, but they're much more expensive than anything else on the list for that reason. And then I think we have, just to mention, yeah, if you want to come out on May 14th to our open house and plant sale, you'll get to see the Pop Learning Orchard at the Woodlands. So this is our headquarters site, and part of the intention of this space is to serve as a demonstration for people to come out and see what the options are, see them in person, how they're grown, learn about what it takes to grow them in this region. So please join us for that if you're interested in seeing that. And next slide, you'll see sort of what we have planned there. It's actually, the photo on the left is from our first year in 2020. So we've been using the space in between the fruit trees to grow annual crops for the first few years. And over time, we're converting those rows into more of a food forest, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So we're going to take 5 minutes for some questions. We do have a lot more content to get to, but Simone, you want to pose some questions we didn't get to in the chat?
Yeah, sure. So I answered some of them, but I guess I wasn't completely sure if on the answer. So I guess I'll ask you them anyways. Yeah, there's only 4 questions. So first one from Melissa was, if you have heavy clay, what can you do to amend without creating bathtubs that drown roots?
Yeah, heavy clay. You'll want to amend, of course, with some organic matter compost. If you can work in some sand, potentially can help with that situation as well. Think about plants that will break up the hard pan as well. I don't know. Michael, do you have any other additional thoughts, or Corey, on clay conditions?
I would say all of what you said in building that soil over time, and you could also consider creating berms and planting into higher contours that you created yourself, so the trees are up a little higher and away from that wetness.
And cover crops are a good way to get more organic matter, and that'll make your soil structure stronger and easier to work with.
Yeah, I definitely second that. Planting higher to avoid the bathtub effect is a really smart way to go.
Okay, the second question from Jen was, where does POP stand on paper mulberries?
Well, they're an invasive plant. They do have edible fruit, but it's not something we would ever plant on purpose. There's plenty of them around. And I guess they do have some other potential uses, making paper, so maybe could be harvested for that, but it's certainly not something we would plant intentionally.
Okay, the third question from Michaela was, what design software programs would you recommend for placing and configuring plants and their canopy on the design map?
That didn't come through clear.
Oh, okay, sorry. What design software programs would you recommend for placing and configuring plants on a design map?
That might be a question for you, Simone. I'm an old-fashioned design on paper person, but I know you may have more experience with design programs. Do you have any that you would recommend for?
Yeah, I think, starting on paper is really nice, using trace paper, graph paper. And then if you want to be a little more techy with it, you could use Adobe Illustrator or AutoCAD if you're brave.
Yeah, I think most of the design programs for landscape are proprietary, so you'd have to pay quite a bit to have access to them.
Yep.
There's some, Melissa just shared one, diagrams.net.
Nice.
Check that out.
I'll check that out for sure. Okay, and the last question that I saw from Kyla, I believe, is, can Asian pears cross-pollinate with Anjou pear?
You'd have to look that up. I know that a few of, I believe, I always forget which blooms first, but a few of the Asian pears do cross-pollinate with a few of the European pears, but you'd want to check that out on a pollination chart. But it is possible for some of the Asian pears and some of the European pears to cross-pollinate, but most don't. All right, we'll move on. So next we're going to talk about food forests, mixed orchard plantings. So as we've mentioned, POP is planting ecosystems, so not just fruit trees, but many different layers of plants growing together. Next slide, I'll talk you through that and sort of our approach to food forests. So food forest is an example of a plant community, also called a polyculture versus a monoculture. So rather than in industrial ag, an orchard of apple trees or a field of corn, we're planting many different plants together, which is ultimately more productive per square foot with less labor and lower environmental impact, and is combining the practice of interplanting and companion planting to create a polyculture or a plant guild, basically a group of plantings that functions well together as a whole, where different plants are contributing to each other and ultimately increasing yields. So a very simple but powerful example of that is the Three Sisters Guild, working with annual crops. The corn, beans, and squash is not only the staple of many indigenous diets, but also a powerful growing system with the beans, climbing the corn like a trellis, feeding nitrogen to the corn roots. The corn oozes certain sugars into the soil, which feeds the beans, and then the squash growing around that functions as green living mulch to retain moisture, etc., and high yields from all these plants together. So a food forest is a more complicated perennial version of that, also sometimes called an edible forest garden. I did want to point out, though this term was coined in the permaculture design movement, this approach to food growing is common to cultures around the world for thousands of years. But basically the idea is designing to mimic a natural ecology, a multi-layered orchard, which maximizes and diversifies yields, includes plants not only for food production, but also medicinal value, for soil building. We'll talk about different types of plants that build soil, for pest control and providing habitat for beneficial insects. We'll talk about ways you can do that. And then other functions may include beauty, an important one in the city for engaging community is to have beautiful spaces as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So in a food forest, you can identify 7 different layers of plants, starting with the taller trees, the canopy layers. So these would include your larger nut trees or standard rootstock fruit trees, maybe some nitrogen fixing trees in there. Subcanopy, these are your semi-dwarf and dwarf fruit trees, lower growing trees. Then you have your shrub layer, your berry bushes, nitrogen fixing shrubs and other things in that layer. Your herbaceous layer, your taller growing perennial herbs, flowers, and other useful plants. You've got your ground cover or soil cover layer below that. And then below your feet, the rhizosphere or the root layer, not only where, of course, all the roots of our plants dwell, but also essential fungi and other soil life that supports our orchard plants, potentially perennial root crops, edible mushrooms, etc. And then, not to be forgotten, the vertical layer or climbing or vine layer, which can be important in the city when we may have limited horizontal space to think about using walls and fences for food production. Just a couple quick images. The one on the left is from one of our school orchards, food forest. You can see that very diverse understory growing in and around fruit trees and berry bushes. On the one on the right from the Central Rocky Mountain Permaculture Institute, high in the mountains of Colorado, where I did some of my training. And again, you can see the diversity of that understory. Always something blooming, something fruiting, just really beautiful spaces. And just to briefly touch on ecological succession. So just to keep in mind that landscapes, ecosystems evolve over time, and we can work with this in a few ways. As you saw in our photos of the pop learning orchard at the Woodlands, while the trees are young and there's still plenty of sunlight, we're growing annual crops in between them. But you want to think about transitioning over time. Basically, in the young years of a food forest, you're going to have more production from those lower growing layers, and then as the trees grow and cast more shade, that production is going to shift up into the trees. But you may want to think about a little wider spacing on your fruit trees and mimicking more of a savanna setting than a full forest setting if you want to retain some productivity in the lower layers of your orchard. So we often plant our food forest sites with a little wider spacing to retain some sunlight into the lower layers. And we talk a little bit about the inclusion of pollinator or insectary plants. So not only attracting bees and other pollinating insects, which are required in order to produce fruit, but also thinking a lot about beneficial insects that are predatory or parasitic and may help us control pest populations. So the goal is not to eliminate all pest insects, but to have a balance where we have insect allies around us that prevent outbreaks of pest insects that would require intervention by the human stewards of the space. And some things to think about, some of our favorite plants for inclusion are long blooming perennials like catmint and anise hyssop that start blooming in May and will bloom all the way till frost. Coneflowers, bee balm, tickseed, things that bloom a long time are going to help us retain those beneficial insects on site and build their populations over time. One of the seasons we emphasize that you think about in your design is fall. There's lots of spring blooming and summer blooming plants, but not many that bloom in the fall. So the asters are really the backbone of that for us, blooming late into October. Goldenrod, another great fall blooming plant. We also like to, we have another slide about different types of flowers, but umbels is a family of flowers we particularly like because they're really good at attracting some of those predatory and parasitic insects. So perennials including fennel and lovage, annuals like dill are within this family. And so diversity is good in a food forest, not only in different fruit types, but also different types of flowers. So you attract different types of insects. And again, building that balanced ecology of insect life. So think about different styles of flowers, different types of flowers in your orchard. Then we have soil building plants, including nitrogen fixers, which we highly recommend for inclusion in a food forest. So a whole class of plants that actually pulls nitrogen from the air and fixes it into the soil, working with certain soil-based bacteria. And these can be shrubs, trees, or they can be herbaceous plants. We've got a list on the next page of some of the options. So you can have tree nitrogen fixers. We don't use a lot of these in the city because we reserve most of those spots in our designs for fruit trees and nut trees. But occasionally you might think about these. Alder, black locust are some native ones. Ottoman olive and mimosa are both considered invasive, but are nitrogen fixing trees. Shrubs, some of our favorites. Gumi is a wonderful fruit producing nitrogen fixer. Seaberry is one we're experimenting with. Pea shrub is one we've planted a lot. Bayberry is a native nitrogen fixing shrub with some other beneficial qualities that we like a lot. Silverberry, New Jersey tea. And then there are herbaceous plants. Some of the perennial flowers that we plant a lot that are nitrogen fixing are false indigo or baptisia, Carolina lupin. And then we have clover as a ground cover, groundnut is a nitrogen fixing native vine, vetch, and then we have annual cover crops, alfalfa, beans and peas are both nitrogen fixers. Next slide. And then we have plants that help add nutrients to the soil in a different way. So these are plants with deep roots, pull up essential nutrients from deep layers of soil, bring them up into their leafy biomass, and then that dies back to the ground in the winter, or in some cases intentionally harvested for this purpose. And those nutrients are now available to trees and other plants. Most of trees' roots are in the top foot of soil. So these plants often actually have deeper roots than the trees do. And this sort of chart on the right is somewhat disputed. I would not take to heart that any of these specific plants are super helpful with these specific nutrients listed here, but there's still research being done. The one I did want to highlight in particular is Russian comfrey, is one of our favorite companion plants. So there you can see that chart, which is under investigation. We'll say that. But one I wanted to highlight is comfrey on the next slide, that we plant a lot in our orchard spaces because it is an incredible producer of biomass, green living mulch. So the type we plant is Russian comfrey, which is a sterile hybrid, so it's not going to reseed itself. This is a plant that's very robust with super deep roots, very, very hard to get rid of once it's there. So it's not one you want to plant that will reseed itself and cause yourself challenges in that way. But it is a wonderful medicinal herb, a healing herb, generates tons of big leaves that you can cut back multiple times a year to add to your compost or spread around the base of your trees. They are very tolerant of poor soils and drought. They'll outcompete any weeds. They provide pollinator food for bees, etc. Also habitat for spiders and other beneficial insects. So one of our favorite plants for building biomass and improving soil. Then we have our aromatic plants. So we include a lot of strong smelling herbs in our orchards because they can help to throw off pest insects who are usually looking for a very particular plant or plant family, and these strong scents can make it a little more challenging for them. So we love the mint family in particular, but a lot of culinary herbs are useful for this purpose: oregano, thyme, etc. Catmint is one of our favorites. And then we have onion family plants, also chives, garlic chives, walking onions are all perennial onion family plants that have yields, but also are useful in throwing off pest insects, as well as potentially rodents in some cases. We've been planting garlic around the base of our fruit trees in the learning orchard. And then animals can be part of a food forest as well. We're designing and planting ecosystems. Of course, every ecosystem includes some animals as well. So bees, of course, a natural companion to orchards, whether they're honeybees or various native bees. Poultry can be a great part of a food forest ecosystem. You can see turkeys here wandering through a food forest, but they'll go around and they'll munch on pest insects, they'll deposit fertilizer, and lay eggs, provide another yield as well. And then some food forests are designed for grazing animals, not something we've done in the city, but certainly another thing to consider in a larger space. So just a quick example of a food forest design here. This is just showing a close-up of one of the beds in the Penn Park Food Forest, which is one of the more established food forest sites we've planted in the city. And you can see here the large, if you're not familiar with plant designs, those larger circles are the trees, and then the sort of wiggly lines underneath are showing areas of planting of specific perennial companion plants. So our approach has been underneath the trees themselves to plant a big grouping of a ground cover. And this is just for ease of maintenance. We have lots of volunteers involved that may be not familiar with all the plants. So having things in groupings makes that easier for people to recognize what they're looking at. So you want something shade tolerant in terms of the ground cover. We like the ground covers under the trees, so they're low growing. You can walk on them to harvest the fruit without damaging the plants. And then in between the trees, you've got space for your larger growing perennial companion plants. Also planted in groupings for ease of maintenance. Planting one thing here, one thing there can be very challenging for people not familiar with all the plants included. So anyway, that's just a quick overview of what one of our planting plans looks like. And there's some nitrogen fixing shrubs in there too. And this is just a view of that Penn Park food forest. You can see again that diversity of companion plants in and around the fruit trees, and many different blooms and colors at the same time, and a healthy ecosystem. So we're going to get into design process. I'm just going to give a quick example. This is from a community design we did a few years ago for something in West Philly. And then I have a short case study example from Union Baptist Church, which is a historic Black church in Graduate Hospital neighborhood, that we helped to design an orchard a few years ago. And so this is showing two iterations of that design. So typically, we went out and met with the lead gardener, Mei Ling, and Loretta, one of the trustees, and got feedback from what the community wanted to see in this space. And then we came up with a design on the left based on that input from the partner group. And then we went and presented it, and we got some additional feedback that caused us to make some changes to the design. So they wanted to retain more of the open grassy space to use as gathering space. They also wanted a little more space in between the trees to retain sight lines into the space. So that what you're seeing on the right is the second version, the final version of that orchard design based on community input. And then we have a image of us planting the orchard. And then next slide is what that food forest looks like a couple years later. And Mei Ling, the lead gardener there, with her food forest behind her, and showing a wonderful painting we commissioned her to make. She's a wonderful artist as well as a gardener, and sort of idealized city food forest image. But anyway, that's an example from one site. Then I'm going to turn it over to Michael to take us through the next section here.
All right, thanks for all that info, Phil. So some further notes and tips on community design, if you're doing that, is you want to plan a well thought out discussion with some activities and known outputs. And you may consider hiring a professional to facilitate that process. First, you want to make sure people attending the meeting have a good idea of what they're coming in to discuss. And this could look like attending community meetings ahead of time, tabling events, and other grassroots engagement ahead of a design event like this. You're going to want to bring large visual materials of examples of features, different plants, and different site uses. And then you want to collect your community desires, perhaps through a voting board or write-in surveys, and you want to take notes during the discussion. And then after this, you want to compile that information and synthesize that into a design reflecting neighborhood priorities. And like Phil mentioned, it's good to have an extra step of a refinement process, presenting that design, getting feedback, and then tweaking it to find your final layout. So next, since with community orchards, we are designing just as much the plants as we are for people, here are some tips and excerpts from our community organizing toolkit, a resource that we developed a couple seasons ago. So it's a good thing to think about your strategy for leadership at a community orchard. Each garden and group and project is different and warrants its own exploration of this. But regardless, a dedicated volunteer or paid leadership is a huge part of community orchard success. This could be a full or part-time staff person's domain, a stipended leader, a dedicated volunteer, a group of volunteers, or a mixture of these things to keep your efforts organized. And having leadership role expectations spelled out and manageable can really help a garden and group of people run and feel a lot smoother than in the case when these things aren't clear. And depending on how far you want to go or what you want your garden to offer, community gardens could need or use an organizer or point person for any number of passionate ideas and logistics. At POP, Lead Orchard Volunteer is a program that looks to pair interested volunteers with orchards in or near their neighborhoods for a season or more. Here, the volunteer has an opportunity for a more in-depth and long-term involvement with an orchard while expanding their knowledge and experience. While this helps the orchard partner with regular support throughout the season as well. POP provides additional opportunities to train with and learn with staff, while also supplying educational resources and some stipends on a self-selected need basis. Anyone interested in this program should reach out to POP about becoming a lead orchard volunteer. And then some grassroots approaches to engagement that may or may not seem obvious include just spending time with people, collecting contact information from interested people, networking with other community organizations, posting signage with a contact or web info, posting opportunities for involvement at local community centers, neighborhood events, and sharing this info with other local organizations can help get the word out. Another favorite is bringing your extra produce to neighbors as an offering. And last but not least, creating a plan for managing inquiries of interest as well. So if you have more than one person involved in a garden, you will likely want to have occasional or frequent meetings for group leadership or occasional group-based decisions. Thinking about this garden and its purpose, you want to determine your group's ideal size, encourage and recruit reliable teammates, and consistency is key. So I would often recommend using a time that fits varying schedules, like a weekday evening or weekends, which POP often does with its programs. And then picking a manageable and predictable frequency. So like quarterly, twice a month, monthly, you could go as far as weekly if you have a lot you're trying to do. And then host those meetings regardless of fluctuation in attendance, and plan for turnover and life changes. Send meeting reminders a few days ahead of time, can often influence your participation level. And then creating and following an agenda ahead of time for the meeting, things like that. And the agenda could be set collaboratively, be by the leadership or a hybrid of those. And then keep and store and share your meeting notes. Next, you're more than likely going to need volunteer help in maintaining a community orchard, which can be looked at and achieved in a variety of ways. You may be focused on local and nearby individuals for a small neighborhood community garden, or you could also tap into local outside volunteer groups that are seeking service opportunities to get some bigger things done. A recommended gold standard approach includes the larger monthly workdays, and someone dedicated to weekly monitoring, possibly some bi-weekly maintenance efforts. And when it comes time for harvest and distribution, this might be an easier sell than weeding for a volunteer opportunity, but it helps to have more hands for that. You can find more volunteers and make your garden more engaging through various programs and events. The opportunities are endless with that. And then next, a lot of this might be obvious, but it's easy to slip up. So for volunteer work days, here are a few things to remember or consider. You want to plan the tasks you're going to have for the expected skill level and training capacity that you have. You want to know what you're going to do if you are over or underwhelmed with the amount of volunteers that show up. Having a plan for lots of people or just a few. And then those email and text reminders a day or two before the event can play a big role in turnout. Post updates to social media if that's your communication tool. And then on the day of, arrive early with enough time to arrange tools, gloves, and other necessary supplies. And think about bringing a volunteer sign-up sheet that includes a waiver of liability, and have that first aid kit, some snacks, and some water available. And last but not least, say thank you every time. Other ideas include pausing for a site tour, suggested in the middle of the workday to catch the most people. Take time to explain who's benefiting from their volunteer efforts. Have volunteers sample something from that's growing on site. Consider a special evening, sharing a pizza or a potluck or a harvest celebration at the end of the season. There are things like thank you cards and emails, and if your space is open to it, invite volunteers to gather in the space on their own time to enjoy it. But the smallest acts of kindness and gratitude will go a long way in terms of how everybody feels about their experience. And Phil was going to jump in.
Yeah, I'm just jumping in as a highlight here, talking about community engagement. Want to uplift the Sankofa community farm at Bartram's Garden, one of our key partner sites, as a powerful example of community engagement. So this African diasporic centered farm program engages dozens of Southwest Philadelphia high school students each year in their youth leadership program. They do a remarkable job with this. They also engage usually 1,500 other volunteers each year and distribute more than 15,000 pounds of food to their community. POP partners with them on a monthly orchard workday. We have a team of 5 dedicated lead orchard volunteers that helps out at that site as well. And it's just a wonderful example of how an orchard can be a vital community space for everyone.
All right, well, I guess we're running a little short on time, but I'm going to try to breeze through some steps to implementation after we've covered a lot of these physical and social factors to consider in your orchard design. But we do that to implement, enjoy, and share that space. So here are some recommended steps for implementation. Specific to working with POP, there's an application process involved in exploring that partnership. There's the potential for community design. In this case of some community gardens, you want to create a budget for your project and consider fundraising. Just for example, a small lot food forest could cost like $2,000, while a larger food forest could cost $10,000 in plants and materials. And so community orchard installations are offered on a sliding scale to POP partners, which is great. You want to look at doing some volunteer recruitment, and we also then follow a prescribed course of action, beginning with spring planting of trees, shrubs, and vines, followed by sheet mulching and soil amendments, watering and weeding, and then to prepare for a fall understory planting. Soil testing and amendments. You'll want to test your soil for your nutrient levels, pH, and especially in the city for lead contamination. And then you're going to want to amend your soil and plan accordingly. Noteworthy for community orchards in the city is that woody stem plants have been shown to filter out and restrict lead contamination from entering the fruit. And so it's safer to grow fruit trees on a contaminated lot than it would be to grow leafy greens and other things that are growing closer to the soil. You are going to want to control existing vegetation. Often we do this by sheet mulching to smother the weeds and convert lawn into garden beds. And if done diligently, this can be great at eliminating many grasses and weeds, aside from weeds with big tap roots and extensive lateral root networks. This is basically laying down cardboard and covering it with wood chips. Goats and other animals could be helpful, but they often don't take care of those tricky roots, which may resprout. There's solarizing. It's best done in the heat of the summer. And for higher success, you want to mow down the weeds first, uproot some of the woody plants if they're there, moisten the soil before covering it then with the clear plastic and burying the edges of the plastic to cook it for like 4 or more weeks. The black plastic is okay, but less effective. Vinegar is an option. There's store-bought vinegar, which is a little weaker and can work on smaller, younger weeds, while there's 20% horticultural vinegar available out there that's going to be a lot more effective, especially with the dash of soap or salt. But being careful not to spray plants that you want to keep or ruin the soil throughout your garden. Other options like flame weeders or a 1 or 2 time plowing to, get a clean slate and then mulch and cover crop and go no-till after that. I'm not a fan of landscape fabric because it's an annoying maintenance issue later on often. But if you go that route, use the heavy duty stuff. And then the good old hand weeding and brush clearing is going to be the most effective and the most labor intensive for controlling existing vegetation. Once you've done that, we're getting on to planting. Some go-to standards or rules of thumbs is only digging as deep as the soil in the pot, and planting high is better than low, especially when you're going to raise the grade through sheet mulching. It's helpful to sort of mound displaced dirt in a donut around the tree to assist with initial watering. And you want to do a mulch ring around trees to suppress weeds and for moisture retention. And an easy way to remember how to do the mulch correctly is the 3x3 rule, keeping mulch 3 inches away from the trunk, not built up it against it, 3 inches deep and 3 feet wide is the 3x3x3 mulching rule. Further notes on sheet mulching: the bigger and thicker the cardboard, the better. And if you can, lay 2 layers thick of the cardboard with edges overlapping at least 3 inches and no gaps for the grass to grow through. And then I like to recommend mulching 6 inches deep or more for a complete grass kill. And sheet mulching in spring and summer is more effective than in late fall. And you can sheet mulch after tree planting, and you can even plant into fresh sheet mulch if you cut through it and make contact with the soil below, and then amend extra dirt or compost to plant into in that fresh sheet mulch. And then just a few sort of general rules about watering. For spring planting, you want to water 2 times per week in the first month, once per week after that through the end of October. Your smaller plants, you're going to water more frequently. And then fall plantings require a lot less, just 2 times per week if it's dry. And it's often not dry. So there's less watering and a higher success rate of plants that get put into the fall and overwinter that way. And then you only water once per week in really warm, dry weather in the following season. But again, for your smaller plants, herbaceous perennials and ground covers, you're going to want to give them a little extra love. And established plants should only need water in severe droughts. Another way to look at it is the 5-gallon rule. That's what a young tree wants every week. So you could take your hose and a 5-gallon bucket and time the amount of time it takes to fill that. And that's how much you have to stay at each tree with your hose. And then just one last example is the Wissahickon food forest. It's primarily planted with native edibles and their youth education program and cider aspirations in mind. This installation followed the recommended steps that we outlined here, the spring planting, summer sheet mulching, and then you'll see on the next slide a fall understory planting. And so this young food forest has fared pretty well in the weed suppression arena and plant success rate, considering the initial weed pressure. So that concludes our workshop for today. Here's our contact information, and we're still here happy to take any questions.
I think you answered a lot of the questions, Phil. I guess one that wasn't answered was from Paul. For nitrogen fixers, do the root systems have to overlap with the non-fixer to get the effect?
They do not have to directly overlap. I mean, that's helpful, but ultimately in a successful food forest ecosystem, there's going to be mycelium fungal roots connecting all the plants in the ecosystem, and there's actually transfer of nutrients across a food forest from one plant to another. We do like to, include, I guess, an ideal one nitrogen fixer for every 2 fruit trees. So if you want to think about on that level, 1 nitrogen fixing shrub. So that might help you think about sort of spacing and how many to include, but they don't necessarily have to overlap with every tree they're going to feed. Yeah, anyway, that was a lot of information, and we've shared a lot of links. We'll follow up in an email with this video once we've posted it, as well as the resource page for more information.